Hey there, everyone. Tim from Alpha Wolf Trading coming at you with this week's overview of indexes and sectors for next week. Tell you what I'm looking at. I think we're going to have a pretty interesting week ahead. Very, very choppy market. We are still in I think we are still in a bear market. But we've talked about the fact that you can have some really significant snapback rallies in down markets, right? In bear markets. So I saw a pretty wild week last week with with Apple coming out and being downbeat on their future revenues, and market really got hit by that. But then you had the Fed come out and give us a little bit of surprise on a much more accommodative stance than he had just a couple of weeks ago. So pretty interesting stuff happening there. One thing we've talked about is the fact that you can have some really dramatic, swift snapback rallies, but they can also be extremely frustrating because they happen so fast. Like you get gap ups, you get gap downs. It's very difficult to try and trade them if you're not extremely nimble. You can get caught, chasing, and then wind up, losing. So I mean, it creates some really dramatic moves. But to me, this is not all that healthy of action. Now, there are a couple of things that did happen this week with Bristol Myers picking up Celgene. I think that was a pretty big deal. And actually, the IBB in healthcare could be the sectors that maybe lead us out of this bear market. That's what I'm kind of looking for. Is I'm looking for the sectors that are going to help lead us out. Now, there are a couple of possibilities. There's oil and energy, which has just been, beaten to death. Just about healthcare and biotech, which is actually biotech is, was holding up as one of the best sectors that was holding up, and then it finally broke down when it broke below the 100 mark. But and home builders and building materials, those could be interesting sectors to keep a close eye on. So I'm really looking for the sector that's going to help lead us out, and I don't think it's going to be the FANG names, right? So you got Facebook that's got a lot of issues. You've got Apple now that has issues, and what I'm looking for is some new sector to bring us out of this. But anyway, we'll get to that in a second. Want to bring up real quickly last week's list of stocks to watch. I sent it out for everybody, not just the pro members. And we had some pretty good performers. INSG, which is one that I'm actually currently in, and still have shares. I actually wanted to add to this position. I will be looking to add to INSG on a pullback. We've got a lot coming up this week. We've got CES, that is a big consumer electronics show that, you're going to see some of the 5G names that are going to be reporting. You're going to see a lot of tech names. So things could happen in the tech space. I still think there are going to be great tech companies. I just don't think it's going to be the FANG stocks that are going to lead us out. So CES is a big deal this week. Apps, was had a nice move. That is one I also own. Twilio, nice little bounce, but pretty decent performance in some of these names last week. MRVL, a little thicker stock, but I think that one is still worth keeping a close eye on. All right, so the other thing we've got going on, government shutdown, that is an issue. But and we've got some economic data coming out next week. Now, some of this stuff could be impacted, delayed, could get a delayed release because of the government shutdown. What happens there? They're supposed to be doing something over the weekend. I haven't checked to see if anything was accomplished, but it is not looking real good on the government's shutdown front, and that's something that the markets could be concerned about if it continues to drag on. So we get ISM, we get factory orders, NFIB small business index reports its confidence on Tuesday. We've got job openings. That jobs number that we got on Friday was huge. I mean, that was I don't know if that was just a one-time blip or what, but pretty impressive. and we got a little bit of a tick up in wages, which I think is also a good thing. But is that inflationary, right? That's something for the Fed to be concerned about. We've got FOMC minutes coming out on Wednesday, and then we've got CPI, core CPI, on Friday. So we do have some economic data that can impact the markets. The other thing we've got going on is we have earnings season, which is right around the corner to start up again. And we've got a couple of home builders that are reporting next week that I think we want to kind of pay close attention to. Actually, the home builders kind of look like they were bouncing a little bit last week, and we are coming up into what is typically a good season for the home builders. So that'll be something to keep an eye on this week. And there's one other name here, Kush Bottles. This is a cannabis play. They don't touch the plant. They just make containers and stuff to, child-proof containers and stuff like that to hold the cannabis and your edibles and stuff like that. I think that one is worth keeping an eye on too. Actually, I think there's a lot of constructive looking charts within the cannabis space. So worth keeping an eye on that sector. But let's take a look at the markets overall and talk about why I think this could be such an interesting week. We have a big healthcare conference, considered like the Super Bowl of healthcare conferences that are going to be happening this week. So maybe we see more M&A activity being announced from that event, right? So big deal with healthcare and I think biotech. I think those are sectors to keep a very close eye on. We're flirting with a 50-day. We've got a lot of indexes and stocks that are flirting with 20-day, their 50 days. I think it's worth keeping a close eye on these sectors. The other one that kind of really got my attention is Brazil, right? So you got a new leader there in Brazil, and it had a nice pop off of that change taking place. And there are some names within that sector or within that space, Brazil companies that are very appealing to me, have these decent looking charts. So I think maybe that's something to keep an eye on. Now, it is coming up into an area of resistance, the BRZU, which is the bullish ETF for Brazil, but I think it's got a pretty interesting setup and worth keeping an eye on. It might take a little breather and consolidate a little bit, but might be good to keep an eye on some of those Brazil names out there. All right, so IBB coming up right into resistance, right? This was acting as support, and now we're acting as resistance. Now, it's a little bit extended coming up into this. Let's see what happens next week. Let's see if this event can help us break back over here. But, I wouldn't want to be chasing this just because of the fact that we've already had 4 or 5 days up. But worth keeping an eye on this area. Maybe we consolidate a little bit here, build up a little energy before we try to take that out. IWM, I mentioned it last week. It was kind of my focus, and we had a nice little bounce there in the small caps. Look for that to potentially continue. I think up in the 145 area is where we're going to have some potential resistance, right? So I still like the small caps. The big thing too next week, we've got China and the U.S. delegation meeting on the trade war stuff, right? So if we get some kind of a deal there, I think you're going to see these markets rip. But, I don't think that we're going to see a deal, but we might get some chatter. We might get some good comments that give the market a little bit of a lift, right? So we get some follow through from the Fed being a little more accommodative on Friday, and then we start getting some good news on the trade deal. That I think would be good for the markets, right? So IYT, transportation has been beaten up pretty bad. We had one of the airlines actually come out, I think it was Delta, with some poor guidance. And So we got a big pullback on Thursday, and then Friday, of course, we got a nice little bounce back up. But we're still in a downtrend here, short-term downtrend. I think we need to be careful, but we need to keep an eye on the transportation space, right? If these stocks can move up on bad news, that's a pretty good thing to look for, right? When we start seeing bad news and actually stocks move up, they don't go any lower. Could be indication that we are finding a bit of a bottom. So QQQ, even though the techs, right? Even though Apple gave that disappointing guidance, we got the big drawdown and on Thursday, and then we bounced right back on Friday. We'll see if we get any follow through. Like I said, I think there are good tech names out there that could continue to take the sector higher. It just doesn't. I don't think it's going to be the Facebooks and the Microsofts and the Apples of the world. I think it could be something else. So we have to keep an eye out for that. SMH, right? Kind of have a look of a little bit of a double bottom test here. Chip names could be under pressure, but NVIDIA at CES has got some kind of a special announcement that they're going to be presenting. I think if NVIDIA gets a nice pop, maybe the semiconductor space gets a nice pop. We'll have to see what that announcement is, but SMH is worth keeping an eye on. If we break below $80, I think that becomes problematic for SMH, but let's see what this does next week. The S&P 500, a little bit of a consolidation here. I mean, we're still making lower highs and lower lows, and right now we've got a little bit of a higher low right here. Let's see what happens. But nice bounce on Friday. I just don't know how sustainable that is going to be. A lot of things to absorb this week that could impact the markets, right? Oil, nice little bounce in oil. Looking like we're going to have some resistance, maybe around $11 or so. I like some of the oil and energy names. I've got a couple of them on my list for this week for the pro members. I think we've had a pretty good beatdown in oil and energy. I think maybe we could see a nice move higher in that space, but let's see how it plays out. The dollar pulling back, seeing some weakness in the dollar, looking like it could potentially break down. Typically, that would be good for the big multinational names. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But interesting action in the dollar. Strong dollar has been putting a lot of pressure, I think, on equities. So a weaker dollar, I think, would be a good thing. Aerospace Defense kind of looks a lot like the SPY, right? I mean, a lot of these charts look similar, right? We came down an area, bounced, and we're putting in a little flag pattern here. Are we going to go break and go lower, or are we going to actually continue to move higher? We'll see. I think the big area of resistance in Aerospace Defense is around the $85 area. See if that acts as price resistance. Home builders, I brought that up that we've got a couple of home builders reporting this week. We'll have to see how their earnings come in. But actually, the sector has been kind of bucking the market a little bit. It's testing I think that's the 50-day moving average right there. Let's see if we can take that out next week with some positive earnings. I think then you're going to have some potential resistance somewhere around 36 range in this XHB, but definitely worth keeping an eye on that space. XLB, building materials. So if we get some good numbers out of the home builders, potentially that benefits XLB, building materials. We'll have to see. But energy, talked about oil. These energy names are going to be tied to USO. We'll have to see how that plays out this week, but definitely a sector that I'm keeping a pretty close eye on. Financials, a little bit of a bounce. Bigger, thicker stocks, they could wind up performing well. More of long-term hold type considerations. I'm not really paying that close attention to financials. Industrials, right? I think, the other thing that could happen this week is this is the time when if companies need to pre-warn, this would be the time when it starts to happen this week. So ahead of their earnings, right? So that's the other thing we could see. And if we get some more, some more weak guidance out of some of these big names like Caterpillar or some of the big industrials, that could weigh on the sector. But right now, kind of looks like we've got a little bit of a flag pattern going there. XLP, which is consumer staples, nice little recovery. I mentioned last week that there's some packaged food plays that were kind of interesting to me. I think that sector has been beaten up pretty hard, and I think that there are a few names that still are worth keeping an eye on. One of the names last week that actually held up pretty well, was up 15% for the week, was Dean Foods. And that's been a pretty beaten up name. So I think you continue to watch the consumer staples space. That's considered more of a safety trade. XLU Utilities, another one that's considered a safe trade, a little bit of a bounce. Looks like we're trying to find some support here at this price level. We'll see what happens next week. XLV Healthcare, right, was holding up extremely well. It had a little bit of a double top, pulled back, and now we're in an area where it bounced off some potential price support with that action of BMY last week and the big event this week. Maybe this sector continues to climb higher. Metals and mining, so gold is, Carter Worth, I watched him on options action. I'm not a gold bug. He seems to think that the move is just beginning in gold, but I'm kind of thinking in the near term may take a little breather in some of the gold mining, and gold itself might get a little bit of a pullback in that space. Not saying that it might not 2 weeks from now be higher, but I'm thinking in the near term we might get a little bit of a pullback. But there were other material names that had a bounce. Some of the steel names, some of the what do I want to say? Copper miners. So there were other names within the metals and mining space that did get a little bit of a bounce last week. We'll see if we get any follow through there. XOP, just oil and gas exploration and production. Little bit of a bounce there, looking for potential continuation there. And then retail also had actually held up fairly well last week, but as many of you know, I am not a big retail fan. I just don't seem to trade well within that space. So that's just a personal thing, but that doesn't mean that maybe you're not interested in some of the retail names. So worth at least keeping an eye on. It does look as though it's had a pretty nice little bounce, maybe coming up into an area of price resistance here, but I would say somewhere around this $43 area could be price resistance, but worth keeping an eye on retail if you like trading that space. All right, so that is my take on the overall markets. I think it's going to be a very interesting week ahead. I think that there are actually some really great looking setups out there. I have a pretty extensive list of stocks to watch for the pro members this week. Like I said, I went through over 1,000 charts this weekend, and I would just suggest this to you. Make sure that if you're looking at maybe taking a swing or a long-term hold consideration, that you look at taking stocks that have held up well in this market, that are above their 50-day moving average, that are above their 200-day moving average, where you have some clear price support that maybe you can trade against, and then make sure that you don't have any kind of catalyst right around the corner. But there are some other stocks out there, other sectors that are extremely beaten up, where you could get some snapback plays, right? Two different types of trades. But there are actually quite a few good-looking stocks out there, and I'm excited to share the full list with the pro members in a little bit here. Anyway, be careful out there. Make sure you have a plan. Don't get frustrated. I mean, gap up days, gap down days, they can be very challenging. Be patient. Wait for the trade to come to you, and if you don't have it come to you, then sit on your hands. I know that that's frustrating, but better to sit on your hands than chase something and regret it and lose money. Anyway, if you'd like to have the list of stocks to watch sent directly to your email, consider becoming a pro member over at Alpha Wolf Trading for only $197 a year. And that's it. That's it. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and good luck trading next week, and I'll see you all next week.